This is Owen Palmer for Sonic State, here to look at Rezo by Mastering the Mix. Rezo does what Mastering the Mix call resonance suppression. I'll give you an example. So here is a classic 909 ride cymbal. These are known as being rather spitty and resonant. Now hopefully that sounds quite normal, but this is actually with Rezo on, and here it is with Rezo bypassed. You hear that difference? That is resonance. So hopefully you noticed that when I bypassed Rezo, there was a distinct ringing sound. Now, that ringing sound, the ringing resonances, you might expect that of a ride cymbal, but in my experience, you may have subtle ringing resonances in pretty much any sound. Vocals, synths, instruments, percussion. Believe it or not, even white noise effects or sounds based on white noise can sometimes have resonant qualities to them. And those are just areas in the frequency spectrum where there's a slight build-up of frequencies. And that ringing can be either a distraction, where it kind of draws your attention to the sound more than you would necessarily want the listener's attention to be drawn to that sound at that moment. Sometimes the ringing can be quite harsh. It can be quite uncomfortable to listen to. And in my world, working on very loud dance music, hip-hop music, that kind of thing, sometimes those resonances actually become quite painful in the normal listening context. So that's why we'd want to suppress resonances. Now, normally the trouble is when handling resonances, it's very easy to get carried away, because remember that those resonances are a natural part of the sound. It's not the case that resonances are necessarily processing artifacts, although that can happen. Normally, resonances just are an inherent part of the sound that's recorded or produced or what have you. And so when you're focused on those resonances and you feel that they sound bad, as you're reducing them, it's very easy to lose perspective and to think that you're making the sound better where you're actually killing the natural character of the sound. So that's why in my example I showed you Rezo on first. It's a lot easier to gauge whether you're helping the sound or damaging the sound when you listen to the sound on for a bit and then take it off, do the bypass. Especially as oftentimes the resonant effects are rather subtle. So we're talking small, nuanced tonal changes that if you're not really focused on what it is that you're addressing, it can be hard to hear a difference at all or to hear an improvement. In fact, before doing this review, I went in search of Rezo audio examples, and most of them, personally, I didn't find that useful. Either they sounded like, oh, I can't hear much difference, what's the point? Or they sounded like I preferred it before. I preferred how the sound sounded without Rezo. But I'm not convinced that they were necessarily useful examples of what the plugin can do. I think that is down to the bias of the person setting up the audio example in the first place, becoming accustomed to the sound as they've worked on it, and then not giving their audience enough time to really listen and appraise what's going on. So have a listen again as I toggle the bypass on and off. Now, it might even be quite hard to believe that the bypass version is a natural 909 ride sample because it sounds kind of bad in that context. But strangely enough, having had a break since I set Rezo up for this example, I think my processing is maybe a little too strong. And that's an interesting thing because that is really the big challenge with doing this kind of thing. Initially, I had it even stronger. I did it carefully and I really tried not to overdo it, but I think I have overdone it a little bit. But let me reset this instance of Rezo and go from the start. So what you would normally do with Rezo is you play the sound through and you click calculate targets. You wait for it to calculate the targets. It then finds the points it thinks might be resonant problems, but it doesn't do anything with those points. It's just marked where it thinks they are. Now, for each of these, I could click and then do, well, as soon as I click it, it's on, it's activated, it's engaged. Or I could just click engage targets and it will engage them all at once. So have a listen to what the software thinks should happen to that ride symbol. Personally, I think I do like what the software has done. However, in my mind, there's that one whistling resonance. That was the real issue. That was the biggest problem. And that's the one it hasn't dealt with at all by the looks of things. Let me see if I can find that manually. I think it's this one. Naturally, there's always a temptation to think in terms of, oh, that's not a nice sound. Let's eliminate it. Let's delete it. Let's eradicate it. But that kind of approach tends to cause more problems than it solves. As I say, resonances, it's a very delicate thing. This is a dangerous tool. You can do a lot of damage with this if you're not very, very careful with it. And so it doesn't surprise me that the suggested resonances that Rezo has automatically detected, they're rather subtle. That, I think, is wise on Mastering the Mix's part. I think they've made the right choice there. But then I'm left thinking, well, what do I do about the parts that it doesn't reach? Well, I suppose you're going to have to be using this manually. So let me reset this one more time. And what I can do is manually find the resonance that is a problem. Now, you can do that by visually looking at it as I have here, or you can click solo and listen through while you adjust. See, I think that sounds good, but I also know from experience that it's just small moves like that where it can be easy to just basically lose perspective and think that you're making an improvement to the sound when in reality you're destroying the sound. It's a very, very tricky technique to get right. It's wonderful that there's a tool to deal with it. My question now is this tool really up to the job? Now, I'm down with the idea of using what's essentially a dynamic EQ to handle resonances. I buy the concept. I mean, it's a technique I've been using for a number of years in one form or another. What I would have liked, maybe it's asking too much, but what I would have liked is a workflow essentially where you drop it onto the channel you want, and then you set the amount of resonance control you want, and it will control the resonances. You could maybe try it a little bit to see what it's doing. Maybe that's a little bit too much, back it off a bit. Okay, that sounds good. Leave it, move on to the next thing. And that would be fantastic because it would mean that you could handle resonances quickly. One of the main problems with using a static EQ to manually, or even a dynamic EQ to manually address resonances and go through each frequency one by one, looking for those resonances, and then setting up each frequency band to deal with each resonance. The trouble is, it's very difficult to maintain your perspective. Unfortunately, I'm finding that same issue with Rezo. The automatic detection that it does, it's just not perfect. It's okay. It's all right. It's not better than what I could do manually. I mean, it will maybe save a little bit of time, but unfortunately it's not performing the miracles that I would have hoped for. I know that's asking a lot, but that is essentially the concept of the plugin, so what else am I to hope for? And in case you're thinking, he's only tested it on one sound, no, that's not what's going on here. I specifically used the ride because I thought this is an example where hopefully I can show Rezo making a clear improvement, that people can hear it, know that it's doing something, and decide whether or not they like what it is doing. I feel that if I had gone into a huge variety of different types of material to try Rezo on, it would become increasingly challenging for you as an observer to really focus on the details that matter and understand that it is doing something. And as I say, to be able to appraise that and make a decision as to whether or not you like it. Thinking about the features, there's a reasonable amount of latency there. On my system, I'm getting about 70 milliseconds of latency, which is okay. You can play with that. But then again, the workflow of having it detect the targets and then apply to fixed frequencies means that it doesn't have that much use in a live setting. This isn't something that you could put on an instrument and then play the instrument and it will deal with the resonances in real time, because it needs time to analyze the audio, and then it's basically working on a spectral profile of that sound. So for example, I tested it on piano and I found that the notes that I'd played when I calculated the targets weren't necessarily the notes that I wanted to play after that point. And so I got some very quirky results with that wasn't really pleasing. Again, feature-wise, it's a shame there's no undo, because I found myself many times clicking the wrong thing or doing an analysis and then adding a band and then wanting to redo the analysis without changing the band that I'd done. So it would have been nice to have had an undo on the interface. Also, feature-wise, there's a delta control that literally just gives you the opposite of what the plugin is doing. So it plays you the resonances that it's reducing rather than the sound with the resonance reduced. That's, I find, moderately useful, but again, it can be difficult to keep perspective, which is why I didn't demonstrate it in the main part of the video. Now, to finish off, I shall demonstrate Rezo on a variety of materials, and I shall toggle the bypass so you can judge Rezo for yourself.